Hello and welcome to the second day of the virtual conference by the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, INSS, dealing with Russian-Israeli relations in the occasion of marking 30 years since the relations have been re-established. My name is Daniel Rakov and I'm a research fellow in the Russian Studies program here at INSS. It is important to emphasize that today the discussions will be conducted in English. Hebrew was the working language of the first day of this conference, yesterday, December 8th. Yesterday, we presented an overview of the relations through the review of the historical context, the introductory addresses by the ambassadors in Tel Aviv and Moscow, and an interview with Meir Ben Shabbat, who have just finished his job as the head of the Israeli National Security Council. We also started to dive into the details of this relationship through our first panel discussion dealing with the people-to-people connections. If you didn't have a chance to watch, the recordings are already available at the INSS website. Today, we'll continue our detailed discussion of further three important dimensions of the Russian-Israeli relationship: the economic ties, the regional dimension of Russian and Israel relationship in the Middle East, and the global dimension, namely, how does the strategic dialogue between Jerusalem and Moscow affect the global great power competition, and how is it being affected by those competitive dynamics? We have dedicated a panel discussion for each of those three topics. As a prelude to the regional global panels, we'll see several excerpts from an extensive interview we have conducted with Ambassador Dennis Ross from Washington Institute as a part of our wider project to be published in the following weeks of an edited volume of articles dealing with the past, present, and future of Russian-Israeli relationship. We'll wrap up this conference with the summary of Professor Manuel Trachtenberg, the Executive Director of INSS. We hope that this conference will provide an insight both for the expert community and the wide public, and also that it will improve the basis for policy planning and development for the respective governments. Hello and welcome to INSS conference on 30th anniversary of Russian-Israeli diplomatic relations. My name is Daniel Rakov and I'm a research fellow at Russian Studies program of the Institute of National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, Israel. The current panel discussion is dedicated to the economic dimension of Russian-Israeli relations. And in the following hour, we intend to make a SWOT analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of these relations. We will try to understand the main pillars of the economic interaction between the two countries, characterize the current state of affairs, identify main deficiencies, and suggest possible cues. Our panel includes an extraordinary expertise on this subject. Three of our four panelists had written insightful pieces for the economic section of the edited volume of articles currently being published by INSS and MGIMO University Moscow, called 30 Years of Russian-Israeli Full Diplomatic Relations, Past, Present, and the Future. We have here with us in the panel Dr. Dmitry Mariasis, the head of the Department of Israel and Jewish Community Studies in the Oriental Studies Institute, Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Mariasis is the leading authority on the issue of Russian-Israeli economic relations, especially in the innovation realm. Not only does he represent an academic excellence, but also he is involved in practical work of building bridges between the Russian and Israeli business communities through his involvement in Russian-Israeli Business Council. And I must confess that for many years, he's also a great partner of Russian Studies program of INSS, of which we are grateful. Mrs. Yelena Margovsky-Lotem is Senior Energy and Economic Analyst at the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Between 2013 and 2017, she served as a counselor for economic and energy affairs at the Israeli Embassy at Moscow. Today, Yelena will present views that do not reflect any official position. Dr. Konstantin Simonov is Director General of National Energy Security Fund in Russia. Additionally, he is a professor in the Financial University under the government of the Russian Federation, where he heads the Department of Political Sciences. He is also a prominent expert and commentator in Russian media when energy meets politics. Dr. Elizaveta Yakimova is a research fellow in the Israel and Jewish Communities Studies Department of the Oriental Studies Institute of Russian Academy of Sciences. She specializes especially in Jewish communities in the post-Soviet state. And let us turn first to Dr. Mariasis. Although looking into the breakdown of the Russian trade with the Middle Eastern countries and North African countries, Israel is one of the main trade partners of Russia in the region. Overall, Russian-Israel economic relations are a small fraction both of Russian trade turnover and the Israeli one. In your article, you claim that there is a great potential to uncover. Could you characterize the current state of relations and pinpoint the main problems and obstacles in it?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you. First of all, I'm honored and pleasure to be in this conference among high-level experts. For many of those I know for many years, and Elizaveta works with me, and our joint program with INSS is a very important for Oriental Studies Institute, which I represent. And with Yelena, we met not once when she worked in Moscow, and I must say it was very interesting and positive relations we had then. So it's nice to meet. With Konstantin, we're not, I know his works and I know the Institute, but unfortunately we haven't met yet, I think, in person, but there's still a place in future for it. Well, as you said, you know, when I was asked to write an article, I was in a kind of like ambivalent state, ambiguous state of mind, because on the one hand, we've developed a very interesting and positive relations, both in politics and both in economics. Since 1994, when the major basics of the agreements and different kinds of treaties were created that created a framework of our bilateral relations, we've developed greatly. But it was the low basis start development. It means that since between 67 and 91, we didn't have any relations. So when we started in the 90s, we had a huge gap to cover with the development. So we're very positive on it. We're very positive. We have multifaceted relations in state to state, when business to business, on the one hand. On the other hand, I would characterize our relations today in general in economics as a stalemate. Look at the data, look at the breakdown. Our general scheme is raw materials for technology. It means that for many years, Russia main export to Israel is different kind of raw materials, power and raw materials. And on the vice versa, we receive some technological components, machinery, and even agricultural goods, and so on and so forth. But still, if you look on the data 15 years ago, and if you look at the data of the 2020, or even the two-thirds of this year, this particular year, 2021, you'll see more or less the same proportions of numbers and of the breakdown between of our goods and services. Of course, the pandemic, the COVID-19 distortions now are playing back. Now we see, if we compare 2020 to 2020 now, we see that there is a huge development, but because it's a post-COVID development. It's like we're coming to our common like say picture, common market picture. But if you look at the numbers, you have this kind of billion-dollar trade between the two countries, couple of billion-dollar trade between the two countries. It's almost nil. The two parties are involved for many years for the consultations on the future, even not consultations now, it's a full-scale negotiations on the free trade area agreement. I remember when we was Yelena were consulting each other on the initial stage of when it were consultations, and now we're on the full-scale negotiations. But still, we are negotiating, and we haven't concluded this agreement for 5-6 years, and I don't see any breakthrough in this. Maybe Yelena and our Israeli colleagues know something that I don't know, but I don't see any particular breakthrough in this issue. And I think that a major obstacle is technical, because there are some technicalities involving that Israel has to sign this agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union with different countries, where Russia is leading country, but not the only one. And of course, it makes the negotiations difficult. But my major concern is that even though if tomorrow morning we wake up and the agreement is signed, I don't believe that our trade relations will skyrocket. It will be better, and I'm very pro this agreement. I think it will be a very good basics for future development. But in order to scale up, we have to rethink and maybe to reinvent our economic relations in order to understand what do we want, what do both sides want. And I believe that even though tourism and energy and brilliance, jewelry, and agricultural stuff is very good, but I think that our future is in science and technology, because there are two countries that are very interested in this particular part of the world market, let's say. I'll speak maybe about it a little bit later. I don't want to go into details and, to pinpoint each and every obstacle to our relations. I just want us to understand that I believe that even though I think that our today relations are in stalemate, we have a huge potential which lies not in the quantitative edge, but on the qualitative edge. And the quality is the science, innovations, technology, and that's the future. And day-to-day obstacles, I don't want to, if there will be questions, I would answer and say about some particular obstacles that I see from my point of view, but I don't want now to go so deep in detail in this issue. Thank you.
At this stage, I would like to ask Yelena Margovsky-Loten, who has written a brilliant article on the Israeli view on Russian-Israeli economic ties. And there she puts a question mark considering the claim that the two economies are complementary. And so when you listen to Dima Mariasis, how does it look from Jerusalem?
Good morning, my esteemed colleagues. And good morning, Dima. Good morning, Konstantin. Actually, I have the pleasure to meet you in personal during my long stay at the beautiful Moscow. And I hope that we will pass successfully these COVID not easy days and start a new era without COVID. Regarding our topic, actually, I must agree in most parts of the points that have been raised by Dmitry Mariasis, Dr. Dmitry Mariasis. Actually, I agree that the main future potential future economic relations between our states is in the lies in the service and technologies realm. But the main problem is, as I claim in my article, is that the two states actually see as the main markets for even for these technologies in the East and in the European Union. If we look at the numbers and if we look at the data, we will see that actually Israel, as Russia itself, focuses mainly on the markets of the EU and the East. Israel is also focuses mainly on the North American market. Russia for import of technologies, Israel for the export. And taking into account the limited ability of the Israeli companies, I mean, their scope, they're not big usually. It is hard to imagine how the Israeli companies will turn their exports mainly to the Russian market. So it seems to me that there are many obstacles and barriers that actually prevent from our service trade potential. I mean, by service, I mean services, technologies, know-how, etc., as you, Dimitri, mentioned. And I think that before trying to broaden these important aspects of our relations, I think that we should pay attention mainly to resolving these obstacles, these barriers. And if I may mention part of them that I personally could notice, I will mention, of course, the legal aspects, sanctions, and due diligence matters. By saying that, I mean the bilateral, especially from the Israeli side, distrust or mistrust on the Russian partners on the due diligence matters, and the fear of laundering of money and the investments laws. By citing the barriers, possible barriers that I could see, I would mention also the cultural barriers, which usually would arise also from the mistrust, but also from the failure of the cultural proximity. The fact that most of the economic current ties are controlled, I will use this word, controlled mainly by the Russian speakers from both sides, which would usually miss the point of, realistic economic contacts between each and every country. As I cite in my article in the Chinese and Israeli case, there are not many Israelis who can speak Chinese. And yet, in the recent years, there are many Israelis that make successfully and have successful ties with Chinese partners. So the knowledge and the knowledge of language and the so-called cultural proximity is not enough factor by itself to make the contacts useful and mutually interesting. So I see that factor as a problematic one in our connections with the Russian partners. And I claim that we should take the relations from the hands of Russian speakers. only. We need to broaden our scope of relations also to, Israeli-born business people. And maybe one more, of course, we should mention the sanctions regime, which is a main, one of the biggest obstacles for the tightening of our ties with the Russian partners in the economic realm. And I will again point on that the main economic contacts between us, between Israeli businessmen are actually with their North American colleagues. So even though Israel is not a part of the sanctions regime, there are many business people in Israel who are really, let's say, are really try to be really careful with the sanctions regime, which we should remember. It's like it's a main factor that we should consider. And I think that I will conclude at this point and say again, as my colleague Dimitri have mentioned, actually, yes, we have a great potential to broaden our relations to the services and know-how and technologies. But before going to that part, we should take the obstacles, which are a really structural one, from our main road and reconsider the ties. Maybe we should take the existing mechanisms between the countries and maybe turn them from up to down up structure. But maybe we can develop this topic later. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Indeed, it's an interesting and I will say counterintuitive point of this language trap when cultural understanding the Russian culture makes the business excellence victim here, and it's a practical point for the businessmen to consider when they think who is going to be their representative vis-a-vis the Russian Federation. So from here, I would like to turn to Dr. Simonov. You claim in your article that there is a potential for competition in the field of energy between Russia and Israel, especially in the gas export to the international markets. Could you elaborate on the economic and political aspects of this competition?
Thank you very much. Hello to everybody. For me, it's also a great pleasure to be the part of today's dialogue and also to write the small part of this book concerning energy relations between Russia and Israel. I am a newcomer if we are speaking about this expert community which are dealing with relations between Israel and Russia, but I hope to continue our relations and our cooperation. When we are speaking about economic relations between Russia and other states, of course, in the majority of cases, we are speaking about energy. We are speaking about energy, and it's not a secret that Russia is the biggest exporter of hydrocarbons in the world. And also, if you see our structure of Russian export to Israel, you can see that approximately 20% of our export is still export of oil and oil products. But the main part of my article was concerning not about oil, but about gas, because it's more interesting and it's more interesting from different points of view. Also, you were speaking about the future of this story, because, you know, at the beginning of post-Soviet era, there were a lot of plans to build the pipeline from Russia to Israel, but the situation was seriously changed. And now the idea is that Israel can be an exporter of gas also to Europe. And that is why, you know, it's a very interesting example how the situation can be really changing during fast period of time. As I said, we were thinking about build the pipeline to Israel. Now Israel is thinking how to build the pipeline to European Union, and we can be not the partner, but we can be the competitor on the same market if we're speaking about eastern and eastern part of Europe, eastern and eastern western part of south and southeastern part of Europe. And you know, of course, this plan to build the pipeline, so-called EastMed pipeline from Israel, then to Cyprus, then to Greece. And of course, it's a very ambitious project. And also we see today's situation, because it's also a very interesting time when we see the huge increase of gas prices in European Union. And of course, if we see today's prices, we can imagine that all possible projects to export gas to European Union is more and more interesting and more and more profitable from one point of view. But also, we must understand that so today's situation, it's also a very interesting story because it's the first energy crisis in the history of Western world, we can say, which was not organized by the exporters, but which was organized by the consumers, because you know it's the result of policy of European Union, which decided to build absolutely different structure of contracts, to see more hubs, more short-term contracts, and decided to eliminate long-term relations. Also, it's also interesting when we're speaking about relations between Israel and European Union, because if you want to build the pipeline, usually you must sign long-term contracts, of course, because you know you need to have some guarantees of consumption during we can say a long period of time. Because one story is LNG, a so-called flexible pipeline. Another story is pipeline. Of course, in Israel there are several different plans. We can say one plan is to build pipeline, another plan is to build pipeline to Egypt, and then to build LNG. And of course, LNG is more flexible story. But if we are speaking about EastMed pipeline, so also you need to have long-term contracts with Europeans. But European Union during last years said that long-term contracts is yesterday of gas business, and now we need to sign short-term contracts, and we need to have absolutely different structure of relations. EastMed pipeline is a very long pipeline. It's approximately 1,900 kilometers. It's longer than, for example, Turkish Stream, and of course longer than Nord Stream 2. And there are a lot of technical questions. But as I said, today's prices is an excellent story for Israel from one point of view. But from another point of view, we see, first of all, as I said, we see the serious change in European gas market. It's my first point. And then we see also the difficult situation with long-term consumption in Europe, because such high prices on gas is a very bad story for the consumption of gas in European Union. And that is why it's a question, what will be the amount of European market, not today, but if we are speaking about, for example, 5 or 10 years later. That's the main question, because you know, if European Union can return to the model of competitive market, and if Europe will see the battle between gas-to-gas exporters, so-called gas-to-gas competition, and if you compare, for example, the possible price of Russian gas in east part of Europe and the possible price of Israel gas, of course, Russia still has some opportunities to be number one if we're speaking about supply of this part of Europe. And you know, for example, last news when Gazprom gave very, very low price for Serbia, $270 per 1,000 cubic meters. So that is why for Gazprom, it's a possible price. Of course, it's 3 times less than today's hub price, but for Gazprom, it's still possible to do it. And also, if you're asking me about political questions, of course, there can be not only economic problems, not only technical problems, but also political problems, not with Russia, but first of all with Turkey. because it's interesting that Turkey became the serious gas hub. You were speaking about south part of Europe with the help of Russia, not only Russia, with the help of Brussels, because first alternative pipeline was built through Turkey. I mean the pipeline Tap-Tanap. So from Azerbaijan, this pipeline is going through Georgia, then to Turkey, and only after Turkey is going to the European part, to Bulgaria and to Greece and Italy. So that is why we see, and also Turkish stream is also now going, then Balkan stream is also going through Turkey. And that is why for Turkey, there is no interest to see an alternative route of gas without Turkey as the gas, we can say gas gate to the south part of Europe. So that is why it's an interesting project, but still there are a lot of problematic points, economic, technical, political, and but it's very interesting to see maybe we can say market competition between Russian gas and Israel gas in European Union.
Thank you. So, Dr. Yakimova, Dr. Mariasis have already spoken about his thoughts about free trade zone agreement between Eurasian Economic Union and Israel, and he thinks that it will not bring some skyrocketing in the trade. What do you think?
First of all, I would like to say that I'm grateful to be here today. Thank you very much for such an opportunity. And I would a little bit argue with my colleague, with Dr. Mariasis. First of all, I think that the free trade agreement between Israel and the Eurasian Economic Union could help to deepen cooperation with some actors that are now peripheral partners for Israel in this union. For example, Armenia. Here I would give one example. Armenia in 2022 plans to open its new free trade zone. It's called Gyumri, and it is based on air transport, and it can bring potential benefits for the relations between Israel and Armenia in general, because there were some consultations when this free trade zone was created, how to use the potential of both sides in order to make this project more popular. On the other hand, it can boost the general cooperation inside this free trade agreement between all the sides. But I also would like to argue with Dr. Mariasis because to my mind, of course, technique aspects are very important here when we are speaking about obstacles in striking this free trade agreement, but there are a lot more difficulties. Some of them, to my mind, are connected to the sphere of politics, where Russia, unfortunately, doesn't see in Israel a kind of systemic integration partner, because in general, Eurasian Economic Union is just a part of big integration project in Eurasia that is led by the Russian Federation. And here I would like to draw your attention to the experience of Iran, because Iran is a successful experience of integration because Iran already has an interim agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union, and now the country is doing its best to strike the permanent one, and its story of success is based on several factors. Its geography, because it is close, and logistics, and of course political sphere. And political sphere is connected not only to the fact that Russia has interests in the Middle East, and these interests are connected with Iran, but also with the fact that Iran helps to create a kind of regional environment for more close cooperation between the Eurasian Economic Union and the Middle East. Here I'm speaking about Syria. And Syria, for example, started to show her interest in free trade agreements with the Eurasian Economic Union at that time with the customs free between Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan in 2013. And it was the same time when Israel firstly showed its interest too. So that's why Iran also provides some opportunities to make this cooperation deeper, because now the official reason why Syria is not there, doesn't have such an agreement, is the conflict. But the Syrians, firstly, it was not involved in this integration project because of the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, but finally it managed to become the full-scale partner inside the Eurasian Economic Union. So that's why I think that, first of all, in order to strike this agreement to be successful, Israel also needs, Israel and the other sides inside the Eurasian Economic Union need to solve somehow also political problems. And one more aspect I want to draw your attention to is Russian-Israeli relations in the framework of the Eurasian Economic Union. So Dmitry said that he does not see a huge direct impact of this free trade agreement on the possibility to boost the ties, economic ties between our countries. Here I can agree with him on the one hand, but on the other hand, to my mind, very often Russian-Israeli relations are too much focused on politics, on Middle Eastern conflict. That's why I think that this free trade agreement could help the sides a little bit shift the focus of the attention and remind that the sphere of economy is also a very prospective one.
Thank you, Elizaveta. It seems that you suggest some way forward how to make an economic integration between Israel and Iran through Eurasian Economic Union. It's an interesting suggestion for the Israeli government. So let us dedicate the second part of our discussion to the future and the possible solutions for the problems that were raised by the different presenters previously. So Dr. Mariasis, what are your practical proposals to the decision makers in Moscow and Jerusalem to help the materialization of the great potential you envision for Russian-Israeli economic trade relations? What are the most promising sectors to focus on?
Well, first of all, let me thank Yelena for continuing my speech, because many obstacles that she mentioned, I've mentioned in one of my articles, which is going to be published in the NSS as well. So it's good that we think together on the different, from both sides, the experts think and look in one direction. It is very good. It means that we have really potential to build something valuable and long-lasting, sustainable. Now they used to say this word. First of all, of course, many people like to speak about the tourism, and of course there is a potential. We can also speak about some different issues, but I will turn to technology and innovations. And my practical stance is that I believe that in order to build something interesting in this direction, in practical means, I think that if we start from this kind of incubation or acceleration system in Russia with the participation of Israeli representatives as mentors and investors and business mentors, could be one of the starting points for the future development. For example, I see two major ways of this kind of cooperation. First of all is Russian technologies combined with Israeli experience in business development and joint or Israeli financial participation. Second way is more or less the same, is the formation of a joint Russian-Israeli technology team combined with Israeli experience in business development and joint or Israeli financial participation. Such possible configuration will give a Russian opportunity to bridge the gap between science and innovation and to increase the efficiency of interaction with external markets for the country beyond the raw material supply. It doesn't mean that we don't have technology companies that feel themselves well in the broader world, but I think that we have less than is possible. and due to some geopolitical issues as well, of course, but still. And this configuration will give Israel the opportunity to gain access to the Russian scientific and technical community, both to human resources and to infrastructure, to get more or less an expensive production base where it needs to have, and to expand the base of growing innovative projects of high quality, or of good quality. But in order to start even this acceleration project, the two countries have to work to make a kind of a homework and to rethink several issues. For example, I believe that we Russians, we should realize that we need the partnership, that kind of partnership, more than Israel needs. Second, we have to understand that maybe if we look at Israel, we have to reconsider our views on the Russian views on the possibility of multilateral cooperation in the innovation sphere, which is now a very acute, a very important issue to think about, and facilitates the conditions for attracting financing to venture projects in the domestic market. And to my mind, the Israeli side should stop treating Russia as a conditionally third world country in terms of technology, where you can only sell your technologies and services, which is in my practice is a very common sense. Objectively access to scientific and technical potential of Russia. And the most important, I would say, slightly transform its Israeli idea of maximizing utility in the international arena by increasing the importance of its own ecosystem as a platform through which innovative projects of other countries can be carried out under certain conditions, and not to invest all the efforts in projects formerly born, let's say, in Israel. So if we will look at it and reinvent this kind of cooperation, I think on the practical issues, if we start from this, I believe that will come to kind of a new level of better understanding each other, including these language problems, cultural problems, and will be not so important, let's say, not so important, not so acute. From this starting point, we can broaden our cooperation, and maybe we will be able to build a basic framework for a sustainable cooperation in the fields of innovations and technology. Of course, not forgetting about all the other ways of economic cooperation, services, products, if FTA, free trade agreement, of course, not forgetting about that. That's it.
Yelena, what is your prescription for how to circumvent the obstacles, and are there new institutions to be built?
Thank you. I'm not sure that I have the prescription, but I should agree with Dr. Mariasis actually again and again, as we both of us interestingly have pointed out, we need to broaden our know-how, technology, high-tech relations dimension. And it also connects to what Dr. Elizaveta has mentioned regarding the Eurasian Economic Union, or might be connecting. And there are several problems with that union, which the main of which is the potential agreement does not include a service, the services part. So we are speaking just on broadening the goods trade, which is a problem by itself. And again, I will go back to the point of high technology. I dramatically agree with Dr. Mariasis. on the Israeli part, we should abandon, and we may abandon actually, the huge mistrust, which has its origins on many factors, but again, as I mentioned before, is a failure of cultural proximity. Yes, so I believe we need to broaden the relations also, not just to the Russian speakers. Israel needs to take a pivot to Russia, if I may use this term, as we at the time 3-4 years ago used the pivot to Asia, to China, which proved itself to be really successful. And we need, I think that we have some good existing formal mechanism that are aimed to broaden, deepen the relation, economic one, but we need this mechanism which include Joint Economic Commission, Rosnano, cooperation with the Innovative Authority of Israel, etc. All of them go from up to down. I think that we need to include the business circles in this mutual discourse to see what are the business circles' needs, what are their interests in the Russian abilities. And yes, we, the experts, we know that Russia has the ability, innovative ability, also not just in the science realm, but also many proven abilities in the sphere of technologies. In fact, many Western companies outsource their work and needs, technological ones, to Russia. So again, I will summarize by saying and pointing out that we need to take this discourse to more practical, less formal maybe level, to broaden the ties also to the business circles of both countries, and to incorporate the business discourse with the formal one in the formal existing mechanisms, and maybe to invent or reinvent some new ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Konstantin, when I look into the future, so how does Moscow views this? How does Moscow view the threat of competition in gas realm from Israel? And another issue is the issue of climate change. How does it influence our possible energy cooperation?
You know, if we are speaking about gas competition, we are not afraid of market competition, as I said. So it's not a problem for us. We are afraid of not market competition with using of political methods. But climate change is an excellent question. And of course, it's a very interesting question because, you know, and it's interesting that in my opinion, Russia and Israel, they're in the same boat if we are speaking about the influence of climate agenda on energy sector. Why? Because, you know, it's maybe strange because, of course, Israel is, we can say, south country. There are a lot of sun, and that's why it's possible to think that it's a good idea to develop, for example, solar energy in Israel. But, you know, if you see the today's figure and today's data, you will see that in Israel energy balance, the share of renewables is still a little bit more than 5%. So, the consumption of hydrocarbons in Israel today is, you know, in comparative, of course, units is 20 times higher than the consumption of renewable energy. Even the consumption of coal is still 3 times higher in Israel than the consumption of renewables. And that's why, if we're speaking about the development of, but of course, I see the very rapid development of renewables in Israel. It's approximately 60–70% during last several years. And if we're speaking about last 10 years, the average increasing of renewable energy production is approximately 40% in Israel. Of course, in Russia, we don't see such figures, but you know, it's still the energy only for the local consumption. If Israel wants to be like Russia, an export energy power, an export energy state, of course, it's impossible to export renewables. That's why we can see the substitute of maybe coal, first of all, in Israel, then maybe the substitute of oil by renewables in Israel. But that's why it means that you will have more opportunity to export gas, because it's not profitable to export renewables. The price of transportation of electricity is 7 times higher than the price of transportation of gas. So this figure is, we can say, can kill all ideas of export of electricity. Because we also have such plans. And Elena, if I'm not mistaken, mentioned Rosnano company. It's also a good example of that. The development of renewables cannot be an easy story in Russia or maybe in Israel, because now maybe you don't know the last news from Russia. Rosnano now is on bankruptcy process because Rosnano is a bankrupt company. Rosnano cannot pay for their bonds. And it's, the unique story because it's a state company. And now we see the process of bankruptcy. So forgot about cooperation with Rosnano. It's not possible to cooperate with bankrupt company. But Rosnano was one of the biggest investors to renewables in Russia. Also, it was a big investor to solar energy. Now we see the result of this story. So that is why I think that if we're speaking about the future, of course, climate agenda will have a serious impact to the production of hydrocarbons. It means maybe that the battle between the producers of hydrocarbons can be more serious. But, if we're speaking about next 20, 30 years, I'm absolutely sure that, hydrocarbons will still be the main part of energy balance of the world. They will still be the main energy balance of Russia, of course, and maybe Israel too. And if Israel wants to export something, if we're speaking about energy sector, first of all, of course, Israel must think about gas. It's not possible to export electricity from Israel. And that's why I return to my first point. We're not afraid of real market competition with Israel. I think that we can find place for Russian gas and also for Israel gas. We still have some arguments to continue to be number one, if we're speaking about east and southeast part of European Union.
Thank you. And the last question will go to Elizaveta Yakimova. So there is this asset Israel has, the Jewish diaspora in post-Soviet space. So can it play a more important role in upgrading our economic ties with Russia? And how practically can it be done?
Thank you very much for your question. First of all, it seems to me that it's better to use not the term diaspora, but it's of course important for Israel. But here in Russia, I would prefer to use the term Jewish community, Russian-speaking Jewish community, and Israeli Jewish community with Russian background, which now is not similar to the Russians in brackets, as we used to call them in the late 1990s. So if we are speaking about the possibility of these two groups of people to influence somehow the relations between our countries in the sphere of economy, I would rather prefer us to enter the epoch of expert entrepreneurship when Israelis with different backgrounds, with different origin, try to present here in Russia their ideas, their business ideas that are demanded here, and vice versa. Because having even short experience of work with the Russian-Israeli Business Council, I noticed that somehow people from the Russian Jewish community and from the Israeli Jewish community with Russian background, they're presenting their ideas on the basis of their background without thinking where it would be possible or not. But it seems to me that this factor must be taken into account because of two things. First of all, statistically, if we are looking at the example of the United States of America, all immigrants are more inventive. They more tend to be self-employed and work in the sphere of innovation, for example. And the second factor is our current pandemic reality. When it will be over, I hope someday we maybe will see the growth of Aliyah from the first communist state, from the Russian Federation, and this group of people will also be included into this community, and they also may try to start to use their innovative potential, and they could somehow help our side. And also, I would like to make a short remark, since Yelena stressed the issue of services in the free trade agreement between Israel and the Eurasian Economic Union. I'm very often criticized for using this example, but we have now free trade agreement between Israel and Ukraine, and here the sides choose to make trade of goods be the first, and now they're trying to negotiating the aspect of our services. And for me, as I already explained to you my ideas about Iranian model, Ukraine is also a kind of model. And we can use it even not as something to automatically repeat, but at least as something that we can learn from. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we had very fruitful discussion, and thank you all the panelists both for your insight and for your ability to squeeze your ideas into this tight timetable. I must summarize so that at least from my perspective, there are preconditions for Russia and Israel to play a more important role in the respective economies of each other. And this aspect of economic cooperation can cement and broaden the basis of our relationship and produce partial safeguard net against any eventuality of political tensions. I think that this discussion brings us the main lesson that we have to make our homework, as Elena mentioned, and work hard to remove the stumbling blocks on the road of this, on fulfilling this cooperation, build new mechanisms for better understanding, for bridging the gaps between our business cultures. And there is a lot of work for our governments and business community to do. So thank you again, and we'll continue our cooperation both with Institute of Oriental Studies and with Financial University and with Dr. Simonov, and I hope that with Elena also. Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
We are going to watch the video that we have conducted with Ambassador Denis Ross this summer as a part of Russian-Israeli relations project in INSS. Ambassador Denis Ross is a counselor and William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. He played a more prominent role in the US policy towards the former Soviet Union. During the George W. Bush administration, he served as a director of the State Department Policy Planning Staff. During the Reagan administration, he served as director of Near East and South Asian Affairs on the National Security Council staff and deputy director for the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. Later, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping US involvement in the Middle East peace process in both the George W. Bush and Bill Clinton administration. He served 2 years as special assistant to President Obama and National Security Council senior director for the Central Region, and a year as a special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton.
But Putin sees in Israel, Putin wants balanced relations. You know, the change of Russia from the Soviet Union as it relates to Israel is that the Soviets had no interest in balanced relations. If you look at the whole context of the Russian-Israeli relationship under Putin, it's a mixed bag. On the one hand, as you know, Putin tends to look at all the former Soviet Jewry that it lives in Israel now as still being Russian citizens. So he feels there's a certain connection here, number one. Number two, I think he appreciates Israeli power and he's someone who recognizes power and appreciates it. So he wants a certain kind of relationship with Israel. He wants balance in the relationship. He sees Israel as a significant player, and so he wants to have some ability to affect that. But he also sees lots of other interests in the region. And so he wants a foot in each camp in a way that was really never the case before. Syria today is also, you know, it suits Putin to have the Israelis limit how much Iran can do in Syria, but within limits. You know, he imposes limits on the Israelis too. Now, it's obviously from Israel's standpoint, it needs this relationship. Right? It has to maintain this channel. And that again, that suits Putin. Putin wants to be in positions where he has leverage. And so he has it, but it gives him, but Israel also serves his interests because he doesn't want Iran too strong. Mm-hmm. It's not really in the Russian interest for Iran to have nuclear weapons. But how much is he prepared to do to prevent it? No. I think, you know, he loves he likes the 5+1 formula. The Russians have deliberately kept a relationship with groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. And, you know, I think they do it because it gives them options. It certainly gives them options that we don't have. Although I have to say, I can't think of many examples where the Russians have used their influence with Hezbollah or Hamas in a way that has served Israel's interests, or that allows, they've never played a role. Whenever we've had a conflict, the Russians haven't been the ones who brokered the outcomes.
Ambassador Ross, what are your recommendations for Israeli government vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis Russian-American Israeli strategic triangle, and the same for the Biden administration?
The new government should take a practical approach here. It should do its own hard assessment of what's its most important objective versus what I'll call the Northern Front. We saw in the conflict, the 11-day conflict with Hamas, we saw that rockets were fired out of Lebanon, not by Hezbollah, but in one case in an area controlled completely by Hezbollah, which meant there was a loosening of the rules there. And so there needs to be one part of the conversation with the, I think with the Biden administration should be, there's a real risk of a much more major conflict that will make what happened with Hamas look like child's play by comparison. And it's a kind of, that conflict runs the risk of becoming a regional conflict. And rather than waiting until it happens and then dealing with trying to limit it, it becomes important to think about whether or not this couldn't be a fruitful area of discussion for the U.S. and Russia, as in advance trying to adopt a set of limitations that could be imposed that would forestall that. You know, but I had raised it with the administration to say, look, what you can do with the Russians in Syria is not resolve Syria. He's not, this argument I've heard also since 2011, he's not wedded to Assad. Yes, he's wedded to Assad. You're in a dream world if you think he's not wedded to Assad. He's wedded to Assad. But what he's not wedded to is getting in the middle of a war. If you take a narrow arms limitation, arms control approach, there's a potential here. And Russia does have leverage on Iran. Putin's boundaries are going to be, I don't want you intruding domestically. Well, Biden can say, stop intruding domestically on my side. Okay, there's, again, there can be some boundaries there. The problem will be defining them, being precise enough, because Putin will, you know, any ambiguity he will exploit. But Biden will say, all right, look, let's talk about the areas where we can cooperate. Putin doesn't want to get caught in the middle of a war between Israel, Hezbollah, and Iran. And if you have a real war between Israel and Hezbollah, Israel will hit Iran. Not going to be hit with 3,000 rockets a day and let Iran be untouched. What I'm looking at is what's the convergence of interests? The Russians really don't want a war. We don't want a war. Israel doesn't want a war. Ironically, for the time being, Hezbollah and Iran don't want a war. So that's the only thing they all share in common. But that could be enough at least to do, as I said, some kind of arms limitation, some kind of threshold set of understandings.
You think that Biden administration has enough energy to deal with this complicated process? Because it seems that it is too much concentrated on China, and Russia is a nuisance, and you have to build some boundaries to put it aside.
No, but you have to look at it through the China lens. This is kind of the reverse of Kissinger. Kissinger saw the great value of China as a counterweight. And at the time, China was much weaker than the Soviets. Here's a desire to split the Russians and the Chinese. Now, there's limits as to how much that can be done, because Putin has his own interest.
So, if I come back to this idea of Biden-Putin dialogue on Middle East, so does Israel have a role to play?
So, I think that the irony is there's a certain convergence of interest at a high level of generality between where Biden is and where Putin is. They both want boundaries within the relationship. They both want a certain predictability, and they both want stability. Here, I think, is avoiding a war, a regional war in the Middle East, is something that they have in common. So I do see some potential. And I think Israel can play a role here. Israel can talk to both sides. The new Israeli government could go to both sides and say, how do we forestall this?
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Hello, everybody. We are in the next session, which we are covering the relations between Russia and Israel vis-a-vis the Middle East. And as you know, there is so many challenges in the Middle East. So we will try in 1 hour to cover most of those challenges and how Russia and Israel can contribute or cooperate, and if there is some obstacles between us. So this will be open discussions. We have a great team in that case. With us, Dr. Vladimir Morozov, who is the Vice Rector of the Majimo University. He served in Israel in the embassy of Russia, so he knows Israel quite well. Another person which knows Israel in the Middle East quite well is Ambassador Andrei Bakalanov. He is now professor, head of the Middle Eastern Studies Department, Higher School of Economics, deputy chair and also deputy chairman of the board of Association of Russia Diplomats. Another from the Russian side, another person which will participate to the discussions in some minutes is Dr. Alexander Smulin, chief of head of Europe Middle East Center in Institute of Europe of the Russian Academy of Science. Now he's in other interviews, so we will wait for him to be part of our discussions. And from the Israeli side, I'm Udi Dekel, I'm the managing director of the INSS. And with us, Mrs. Sima Sain, she served many years in the Israeli intelligence community, and now she is the head of the Iran program in the INSS, and Dr. Kobi Michael, who is our experts to the Palestinian arena, but also the journal editor of strategic survey of the INSS, and long history of cooperation and coordination between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. So this is the beginning, and this is the people, and thank you very much for your participation. And I hope that we will cover most of the things that we are ready or plan to do. So maybe if it's possible, I will call you the first name. It will be by that we are friends and the open discussion between us. So I would like to start with Vladimir and to say something general, speaking about the relations between Israel and Russia, I assume that, you know, Russia have interests in the Middle East. Israel, of course, have an interest in the Middle East. Some of the interests are overlapping interests, but there is also conflicting interests between Russia and Israel, for example, in Syria, in Iran, and other things. So how you see the great picture of the relations between Russia and Israel today?
Good afternoon, dear colleagues, both from Israel and Russia. First of all, I would like you to congratulate on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Russia and Israel that we're celebrating this December. Well, as far as we have not so much time to cover all the things which are happening in the Middle East, with the participants of Israel, still I would like to say some words on relations between Israel and Russia. I hope very much that these relations will remain stable and productive as they have always been within these 30 years. I think that the relations between Russia and Israel can be an outstanding examples of how two countries can cooperate, even not being political allies in the Middle East. We all know that the major political ally of Israel is still the United States, but Russia somehow managed to build good relations with this country. I would say that after last elections in Israel, where you had new prime minister, new government, we a little bit feared about the future of Russian-Israeli relations. For we used to have good relations between our leaders, President Putin and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And we were thinking how these relations may change with the new prime minister in Israel, but I hope that everything will be all right. So as far as our problematic issues are concerned, so I would point out some of them. First of all, it is the Palestinian issue. Maybe later we will say some words on official position of the Russian Federation concerning possible developments on this track. The second problem is the Iranian nuclear program and the relations, how it can affect relations between Russia and Israel, and what's the position of the Russian Federation towards the Iranian nuclear program. And one of the major problems today in the region that concerns the interests of both Israel and Russia is the Syrian issue, of course. You've mentioned that we have good relations, but there are a number of obstacles between us. So one of the issues is the Syrian issue, because as we all know, Russia has its interest in the Syrian conflict. We have a definite position on why Russia is there and what our plans there. And of course, we definitely understand that it's a matter of concern for Israel, what's happening in Syria, what might be the developments of terrorist activities, because Syria is a bordering country with Israel. And I think that these are the three main issues that can be discussed today, or we can cover this material. And I'm sure that there are some other problems that we're facing when we discuss Russian-Israeli bilateral relations. But I hope very much that we'll try to find a common ground for all the decisions, including the Iranian nuclear program and the Syrian issue.
Okay, thanks. You can see that Dr. Alexander Shumilin participated to the discussions. hello, we're happy to see you. And I would like to go now to, let's say, to the specific issues that we mentioned. And in the first, for you, Alexander, as you know, Russia welcomes the resumptions of the JCPOA talks in Vienna. And this is under the concept of Russia, which believe that the multilateral way is the best way to deal with that challenge of Iran on the nuclear path. And I would like to ask you why, I'm speaking of course from the Israel point of view, why has Moscow opposed any potential of modification of the JCPOA? Okay, because as I understand the position of Russia is going back exactly to the JCPOA as it is. And of course, another issues which is beyond the agreement that Israel put all the time on the table, not only the nuclear portfolio, but other issues such the Iranian ballistic missiles programs or the Iranian negative activity in the region. So how Russia can see now the possibility to achieve any agreement which will take care about the other challenges.
Thank you. Thank you, dear Udi. Am I heard?
Yes.
Yeah, fine.
Quite well.
You are absolutely right saying that Russia is always opposing any modification of the JCPOA. But to which extent is going this opposition, we don't know exactly. But why? In my eyes, it is happening because of the Russian will, of the Russian experience, of the Russian continued and permanent position on this issue, and not to modify, because as we saw recently, any exemption, any change in this construction of the JCPOA risks to degrade the whole construction. But I'm thinking now. I try to think it over this issue. To which extent is Russian opposition going now to any change? I just would like to remind that that Russia has not opposed completely to some proposals issued by the European countries, this by the European Troika, participants of the JCPOA, and there is, in my eyes, some common ground to draw some concrete results and to coordinate these two approaches, the Russian one and the European one, because the Europeans were opposing, as we remember, were opposing the Trump's approach to this issue. So this common opposition, I mean the European and Russian opposition, played a role and looked significantly at the moment. And the difference between Moscow and, let's say, Paris, Berlin, and London was not so visible at the moment of this common European Russian opposition to Trump's approach. But we cannot deny that the Russian approach is rather different from the European. First of all, in which regard? Russia is supposed to maintain not only commercial ties with Iran, but only some connections, some common deals in the defense field, in the military field. And the Syrian conflict is quite illustrative in this regard. The Russian-Iranian mutual trade is rather not very high, but rather big in the volume. And what is the main characteristic in the context of our talk is the military cooperation between Russia and Iran. So Russia would like not to undermine this cooperation, and by either undermining or not, the Russian approach looks like to maintain, to keep the JCPOA as it is, not to undermine the overall European-Russian cooperation with Iran, with some accent, with some focus on the military cooperation field and nuclear cooperation also, but military cooperation is significant in my eyes. These factors might explain some specifics in Russian approach to the Iranian issue.
Okay, thank you. I would like to ask you, Andrei, you know, Alexander spoke about the position of Europe. Of course, we speak about the US, and I assume that Sima will speak about it, but I can say that in Israel, we hear a lot from the US especially, but also from Europe, that they will not allow Iran nuclear weapons. Why we don't hear the same statement from Russia? Russia doesn't have any commitment to the Israeli security?
Well, I was visiting on many occasions Iran. And I must say that to our understanding and to my understanding, there is some danger. There was some danger in Iranians' plan dealing with the probability of acquisition of nuclear weapons. For us, it's a big danger because Iran is our neighbor. So we share with Israel, with the United States of America and Europe in general, the opposition to any plans of Iran acquisition of nuclear weapons. This is point one. Point two. When I was visiting Iran and we traveled in the country, I was even given the opportunity to visit Qum. This is the closed, entity of Shia. We spoke to not only to politicians but also to the religion people and ordinary people, many strata of the population. And I have come to the very distinct understanding that the absolute majority of the population in Iran are not very much interested in the Middle East crisis, not very much interested in what is happening in their relations with Israel, etc. They are mostly interested in lifting sanctions because they are fed up with the present-day economic, social, and financial reality of the country. So if the Western partners give an opportunity for Iran to step forward, there will be quite change of the overall situation. But unfortunately, what the United States of America have been doing during the last few years, it was quite opposite. They were pushing Iran to be on very stern position. Who left the joint action plan? America. And it gives the opportunity for the radicals to start very, rigid criticism over the liberals, saying that we were warning you that these tricks with America are very dangerous and unnecessary. It will not give any results. And you see, we were right. So what American did, it's a very terrible thing. They gave an opportunity for the radicals to feel that they are right and to make the propaganda about the unnecessary steps to compromise with Americans, with Europeans, with us. So what we are trying to do now in Vienna is to return back, and it's much more difficult than it was before. So the situation we are now facing, this is the result of very, very unfortunate and wrong position of the United States of America. And the last thing for the beginning, which I would like to say to you, that there is a big dose of exaggeration as far as the Iranian danger is concerned. Well, they do not have the opportunity to attack Israel. They don't have the wish to attack. They are afraid of you. I must say to you, they are afraid of you, and they internally they think that if something happens, they will be beaten. All this boasting about the military capability, etc., this is mainly for the internal usage. In real facts, your estimation over the intent of Israel, this is wrong. It's a big exaggeration. Really, they are not easy people to understand, and their policy is far from being, as they wanted to present it. It's true. But also, I must say that you should try to make another evaluation of the Iranian capabilities, real capabilities, and real intentions. I have a big suspicion that Americans' military and your military always want to have, bitter opponents, enemies elsewhere, just to be in the good shape and saying for the soldiers that you must be vigilant because we have enemies. In this case, Iranian plays a very important and useful role for the military strata in Israel, in the United States of America.
Okay, this is
this is my analysis,
Okay, thank you, sir. Of course, this is because Iran sent to Israel only flowers, and that's the reason where we don't respond by our flowers. We will discuss it maybe later on, but Sima, I would like to move to you and to give you a little bit some kind of challenge now, because I heard you last week, you spoke about 4 options of the negotiation now. How you can see Russia in those, more and more, less for less, more for more, all that option. Where is Russia from your point of view to challenge our friends to see how we can see Russia supporting those four options?
Thank you, Udi, and thank you very much for, I'm very glad to have this opportunity to talk. I personally have to say that I'm coming from a Russian origin, even though I was born in Israel, but I know even Russian, and I really am happy to be part of the celebration of the establishment or re-establishment of the diplomatic relations. With your permission, I want to say two things about the situation where we stand here, how it is perceived from the point of view of Israel. One is that no question that Iran is today in the most advanced point in its technological nuclear program than it was any time before the JCPOA, after the JCPOA, and this is something that worries Israel very much. I don't think that Iran is very close to a nuclear bomb, but I do think, and this is the evaluation of experts all over the world, is that from the point of view of fissile material, Iran is today in a situation where it can, only with the a quantity of fissile material that they have enriched to 20 and 60%, to enrich it to 90% within 3 weeks, which from Israel's point of view is a threatening situation. This is one thing. The other one is Iran is using the time, 5 months since Raisi was elected, they didn't come to the negotiating table. And even yesterday, we were announced by the IAEA that Iran started to enrich with advanced centrifuge to 20% in the other facility in Fordow, very close to Qom, where you have been. So this is something that what from Israel's point of view, the political umbrella that is now in Vienna allows Iran to continue and promote its nuclear capabilities. And this is something that is very dangerous from Israel's point of view. And that putting aside the issue of NPT, of Iran violating the NPT and the last meeting that was in the Board of Governors, the threat of the US to have a special Board of Governors. I mean, there is a lot of issues on concerning the nuclear project that is continuing to develop in Iran. And people were usually saying Iran is doing it in order to have better cards when it comes to the negotiating table. But I think this is not any more relevant since we saw what they did yesterday and the day before. This looks as if Iran is using from Israel's point of view, the political umbrella, the diplomatic umbrella in order to continue and enhance its program. Now, the question of how Israel sees the Russian position and Russian role, I personally have to say, I think Russia is today much more important than it was in 2015 before the JCPOA was agreed. Because at that time, there was a kind of a unanimous position between the Americans and the Europeans and Russia and China. And within these 6 powers, its position was important, but less than today. I think today with the animosity between the Iranian regime and the US, and the very bad relations with Europe, in spite of everything that the Europeans are mediating between the sides, there is a huge suspicion on the side of the Iranians vis-a-vis the Europeans, and they are blaming them for not for support, even though they were against Trump decision, they were actually supporting because the companies in Europe didn't want to do business with Iran, even though the governments wanted. So when we look with this composition now in Vienna, I think Russia is the most important player that can make Iran decide to go back to the JCPOA. And I think there is a huge responsibility on Russia with this issue. I understand the problematic relations, let's say it like that, between Russia and the US. And somebody wrote to me a day before when we text each other on their Russian position, said, why should Russia support the US and give them lay out now in the dialogue in Vienna. I don't think like that. I think Russia has always, I followed the Russian position for years. I think Russia has always been very positive and it looked very huge importance to the IAEA inspection. And what Iran is doing in the last 2 years, especially in the last year, is very contrary to what Russia was for years supporting the international rules. And here I think there is I don't accept I don't think the Chinese will play a positive role with their very bad relations with the Americans. But I think Russia is not in the situation where China is, and not in the position of China. Russia is close to the Middle East, as you mentioned, doesn't want Iran to have a nuclear capability, doesn't want to have a war in the Middle East that will threaten the situation and the flow of oil and many other things. So I think Russia is in a unique, to summarize, I would say Russia is in a unique position today to play a very important role and a positive one.
Thank you, Sima. Vladimir, because the time is running, I would like to return to you and to discuss the issue of Syria, because there is connection between everything. And from our point of view in Israel, of course, Syria actually is divided. And in the past, Russia spoke about the possibility of decentralizations of Syria, maybe federalization of Syria, so other concepts about the future of Syria. So how you see now the situation in Syria, and do you see any alternative to President Bashar al-Assad? Because I know that some of you believe that Assad is the solution, and we believe that Assad is the main problem.
Thank you so much. Well, answering Udi, your words on whether or not Russia doesn't support Israel's security, we fully support Israel's security as far as the Iranian issue is concerned, as far as the Palestinian issue is concerned. And now going back to Syria, I would say that the issue is very much complicated, as we all know. So Syria was the only regime that didn't fall, actually, after these events in Libya, in Egypt, in Yemen, and in Tunisia. So as far as Syria is concerned, we sent our troops at the invitation of Bashar al-Assad, and we do hear a lot of criticism from the Western partners that we support Assad. The same criticism comes from Israeli partners, but the official position that we don't support Assad, we support the Syrian state. That was the official position of the Russian government. And when we speak about the personality of President Assad, and when you say that is there alternative or is he a problem, there is always an alternative to any problem, you know, and there might be two and more solutions. Today, he is a president, he's an elected president, but I think that there might be a lot of different variants of developments in Syria. So you mentioned different approaches to what may happen with the state, either decentralization of power or federalization. So I think that it's too early to speak about federalization of this country, for the regime itself doesn't control 100% of the territories. If you remember the map, it's half of the territory. So behind the Euphrates, it doesn't control anything, and there are no Russian troops there. That's the problem. So I think that the decision lies in negotiations between not Russia and the Russian position and the Syrian regime, but it also depends on negotiations with the players, regional players, and external players such as the United States. Well, know that the United States participated in military operation against the Syrian regime, and they still control the groups, which we call terrorist groups, or they called it democratic groups, whatever. So the result is the reality, which is that the Syrian government doesn't control 100% of its territory. So I think that together with the United States, I don't think it will happen just right now, but the solution of the future of the Syrian state lies in negotiations, international negotiations. I don't think that in the nearest future there will be a revolution and Assad will step down. I'm sure that it will not happen in the nearest future. Anyway, the international community should negotiate. We all know that there are at least two main international formats of negotiations on the Syrian future. These are the Geneva talks and the Astana format, proposed by Russia, Turkey, and Iran. And these negotiations take place in Kazakhstan. The difference between these international formats is that in the framework of the Geneva format, the Western countries wanted to put both Assad's regime and opposition together around the table, so and didn't go. While the Astana format of negotiations doesn't imply participation of all the warring parties, let's put it this way. And I think that the decision lies in something in the middle. I don't think that having two international formats of negotiations is the last variant. I think that we should think it over. So if it doesn't go neither in the framework of the Geneva format, nor in the framework of the Astana format, there might be something in the middle. And don't forget that Russia and the United States are not the only outside external players in this game. We know the strong position of Turkey over Syria and what's happening in the north of this country. And sometimes it's unclear who stands for what. That's the problem. So there are so many players inside Syria, including all the warring parties, and outside the country, that the situation has become too complicated. But I hope very much that in the future we'll find this decision and stop the war.
Okay, thank you. Alexander, I would like to ask you something because you know, we look very careful upon the Iranian activity in Syria, especially the way that they are building, we call it in the Israeli, let's say, military language, we call it that they build up the war machine in Syria, you know, capabilities that they can use them one day against Israel, missiles, rockets, UAVs, and of course operating militias and other things. So, but the main idea, because we have good coordination and somebody even can say cooperation between Israel and Russia, in Israel, you know, some people believe or expect that Russia will help us to push Iran out from Syria. Do you see any possibility that Iran will push, that Russia will push Iran outside from Syria?
A very important question. So, the concern of the Israelis over the Iranian built-up in Syria is not only Israel's matter. Russia, I can tell you sincerely, fairly, is also concerned about this built-up. And the differences between Russia and Iran in Syria are on the rise, since, or have been on the rise since 2 years, something like this. It is very important matter to take into account while talking about this triangle, Russia, Iran, Israel in Syria. So I believe that Russia in general, I'm sorry, is in a deadlock in Syria, not militarily, but politically. It is a great political deadlock because Russia is moving among the triangle between Turkey, Israel, and Iran. So unreconcilable enemies, some of them. And the best way to Russia, as I see, is to come closer to the Arab or to the prevailing Arab approach to Syria, which consists in the attempt to invite Assad into the Arab, to come back into the Arab League, into the Arab camp, while cutting ties with Iran. It is not possible for Russia to adopt this position and to accept this view completely. But at the time being, I believe that Russia is moving to this direction to coordinate with the Arabs. The main strategy to invite and to imply Assad into the Arab League, into the Arab camp. So it is better for Israel also amid the improving of relations between Israel and the Arab monarchies, Israel and Jordan, and so on. It is very useful for Israel, as I believe. This might be the principal strategy for Russia, because Russia is a lonely player in the Syrian field. The game over Assad, Russia is obliged to counter Turkey on one hand, Iran on the other hand, because Iran seems to be a rival, and Iranians' influence over Assad might be higher than the Russian one. And Israel as a third part, a third angle of the triangle. What is the main gain of the Russian behavior within this triangle? I believe that the fact that Russia succeeded in maintaining and keeping good relations with Israel, despite the fact that Russia has been and remains to be the Iranian ally in Syria, and Iranian ally and some kind of competitor and rival of Turkey. So Israel is a neutral player for Russia, but very important player. And the main gain, I just repeat it, for Russian behavior or Russian policy within this triangle only, not in Syria in general, not in the region at all, but in this very tricky game, Russia succeeded in keeping good relations with Israel, and I hope it will remain like this for the future. So this X, this invisible X between Moscow and Jerusalem in Syria remains to be. But
okay. We have a problem of time because I would like to skip from here to the Palestinian arena because we didn't cover yet the Palestinian arena. And as we saw, as Sima said before, and Alexander said now, that Russia is a key actor in the issue of the JCPOA, and Russia is a key actor, the most important actor in the future of Syria, I believe. Kobi, I would like to ask you, do you see any possibility that Russia will be as well a key actor in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially because going out from the stalemate?
No. The short
Thank
answer.
You, Kobi. Okay.
The short answer is no, and the long or maybe more hesitated answer is probably not. Regardless, and putting aside the historical and the personal relations between Russia and former Soviet Union and the Palestinians, and specifically Abu Mazen, I think that we have to understand, first of all, what is the Palestinian position with regard to the Russians and what are the Palestinian expectations with regard to the Russians. And I think that in order to understand that, we have to go back at least to 2009, when the Palestinian leadership decided to internationalize the conflict with Israel. And they decided to replace the bilateral channel, the negotiation table with Israel, with the international arena, with the international tribunals. And actually they have succeeded at least till the beginning of 2017, till President Trump came to power. And I think that their biggest achievement is 2012, the General Assembly decision about the state of Palestine. And I think that another achievement is the ICC. But in this regard, the Palestinians felt that they might have more achievements in the international arena and by the internationalization of the conflict. And I think that this perception actually became to be much more, I would say, important and crucial after Trump came to power, because when Trump came to power, they understood that they lost America. And when they lost America, they had to look for somebody else that might replace America, or if not replacing America, at least creating a sort of a new balance to America. And they found the Russians, because the Russians are a very important, I would say, component of the quartet, although the quartet is not so efficient in the last years, but Russia is still considered to be a superpower. And I think that in this regard, they believe that they might achieve something with the Russians vis-a-vis the Americans, or at least to balance the Americans. Secondly, I would say that the Palestinians need Russia, because Russia talks to everybody, including in the Palestinian arena. Russia has very good relations with Hamas and even with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Those two players are adversaries of the Palestinian Authority of Fatah, and the Palestinian Authority, Fatah, needs the relations with Russia in order to remain in the picture with these adversaries. And I think that recently we can add also Mohammed Ahlan, who has a sort of an open door with the Russians. And thirdly, I would say that the Palestinians think that they might need the Russians in order to pressure Israel. And taking into consideration all of these aspects and reasons, I think that we can find that the Palestinians are in need for the Russians, and the Russians believe that the Palestinians and any sort of involvement in the Palestinian arena could be leveraged for their broader interest in the broader Middle East.
Okay, thank you. Andrei, I would like to ask you about that because, as Kobe said, you know, Russia still, as Russia used to say, Russia is part of the quartet, and believe that, like other in the international community, that the best solution between us and the Palestinians based on two-state solution. But in the same time, as Kobe said, Russia have good relations with Hamas and Jihad Islamic organization, which opposed any kind of arrangement with Israel, opposed two-state solution. How you can maneuver between those two parties? What is the real vision of Russia about the solution of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians?
Well, Udi, we have today rather frank talks, and I must be frank with you,
of course.
Saying that we are a little bit tired with our Palestinian friends. You know, Egyptians, which are very close to us, you know, this is my main partner, for political partner, Egyptians and us, we have been trying for many years to settle the problem of the so-called unity between the Palestinians, giving the opportunity for them to speak with one voice vis-a-vis Israel. And we failed. We had many opportunities for them to sit in Moscow, well, to talk to each other. They were promising to us something. Then they returned back and they started quarreling again. So what is our position now? Our position is very vivid. We are ready to try once more to give this opportunity, but we are not going to impose this time ourselves for the Palestinians sections. It's approximately the same as what I can understand the position of the Egyptians. So only Palestinians can settle this very difficult problem of sitting together, having one voice, having one government, etc., etc., etc. But I have a suspicion also, if it's a frank talk to us, that you're happy about that. You know, you're happy about this Hamas frigid position, their sayings and their slogans, anti-Israel, etc., etc. Because if not so, we should all of us should return to the most difficult issues of the package of the second stage of the Israeli-Palestinian story. We tried to start negotiation on these remaining points in May 1996. It was already 25 years ago. We started, then you had a new government in Israel, everything broke, and till now we do not have any progress. So what can we do? We cannot do the things instead of you, instead of Palestinians. So we are not very much enthusiastic in imposing ourselves as the mediators in this Palestinian issue. And one more point I would like today to explore this opportunity to tell you about Israel. We are celebrating now the 30th anniversary of returning back of our normal relations. And I must say that these days we regard Israel as something special. Previously, we were dealing with Israel as one of the major partners or adversaries in the Middle East. Now, because of a very important issue dealing with the results of the Second World War, the so-called historical truth about and your noble position over that, I'll tell you that we attach much importance to the position which you have taken in this regard, in the regard of the historical truth about fascism, about the role of the Red Army, etc. And we are regarding Israel to be our global partner. That's why sometimes we more or less are neglecting some difficulties which we have to share with you in Syria and elsewhere. And also, the last point I would like to say to you about Syria. When we took the decision to intervene militarily, it was a very difficult decision. I was in the group preparing this decision. That's one thing. We gave the opportunity for the military to go on, but we decided not to be the part of the story. In disagreements between Syria and neighbors, Syria and Israel. You must know about the background, the beginning of the story in Syria.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I'm sorry that we are losing the time, and Andre, you started to speak about, I wanted to cover also Abraham Accords, as I said in the beginning, but we don't have enough time. And but you mentioned something which is very important, which is the historical weight in our relations, and especially the Great Patriotic War, and the memory of the Holocaust. And in that case, of course, this is give a very good background and support in our relations. And as you remember, our Prime Minister in that time even visited in the Victory Parade in the Red Square in the 9 May 2018, which is also a symbol for our appreciation to Russia, the key role of Russia. And all these discussions, we spoke about the key role of Russia. So I would like every one of you in one sentence to say how you can see the relations between Russia and Israel for the next decade. Is it will be the same as it is now? Is it will be better relations? Or there is any possibility of crisis? Only one sentence, because we don't have time, and I would like to start with you, Sima.
Two sentences. One, I think the relations between Russia and Israel support Russia also in other spheres, vis-a-vis the Arab world, vis-a-vis the US, and puts Russia in a different position. And therefore, I think it will continue, and I assume it will even be more and higher in more spheres of cooperation.
Thank you. Excellent. One sentence. Vladimir.
Dear friends, I think that nothing will remain the same. So in the coming decade, I think that it's beneficial both from Russia and Israel to remain good partners.
Okay, nice. Alexander, you?
I took your proposal literally, one sentence. It depends on the evolution of the Russian regime. Point.
Okay. No, so now we have to start another discussion. Don't we do that? Andre?
I hope that Israel will be our main political partner in the region, and also our co-sponsor as far as multilateral dimension of the development of the affairs in the Middle East, including this climate and water and other issues. That's my expectations.
Okay, Kobe?
I think that both sides are here to stay, and I think that the culture and the historical bonds between both societies, countries, are very significant and essential. And therefore, I think that there is a very wide scope for developing the relations in this term, not only politically and not only strategically, but culturally, economically, and societally.
Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. It was very interesting. I feel that we can stay and discuss for another 10 hours between us. but the message is very positive, and as all of us said, those relations are very important. They are strategic relations, and we can do a lot of things together in order to shape a better reality for everybody. So thank you very much for participation, and hope to see you soon in Israel, in Tel Aviv, because Tel Aviv is the best place. After Moscow, it's the best place all over the world.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Colleagues, it's a great honor to moderate a discussion with such an outstanding group of experts. And I can say that restoration of Russian-Israel relations 30 years ago was a great event. By the way, I was very well acquainted with Alexander Bovin, the first ambassador of the new Russia to Israel. We have repeatedly discussed Russian-Israel relations with him. It was really very, very interesting. To be honest, the last 30 years have only been an episode in the history of relations between Russia and Israel. But this episode is very, very important. And my first question is for you colleagues. What are the most important results of the last 30 years, in your opinion? And I would like to ask Ambassador Regev to start our discussion. What do you think about Russian-Israel relations? Now, honestly, I have a lot of doubts about bridge between West and Russia, but it's an important element of our relations. Okay, floor is yours, please.
So thank you. I'm very pleased to be the person opening the discussion. I've never considered myself an expert on Russia-Israel relations, but I will say the following. I accompanied Prime Minister Olmert on his trip to Moscow. I think it was 2007. I accompanied Prime Minister Netanyahu on some of his trips to Moscow for meetings with President Putin. Obviously, I wasn't at the last meeting between Prime Minister Naftali Bennett and President Putin. I think it's important to have historic perspective. People of my generation, I remember as a teenager growing up and hearing that Israel Air Force was in dogfights with the Russian military in the Suez Canal. Yes, as a child, I grew up, relations between Israel and what was then the Soviet Union, we were shooting at each other, very, very hostile. I remember being aware of anti-Semitic campaigns, official campaigns run by the Soviet government, not just anti-Israel, but also anti-Semitism. And then you think where we are today in Russian-Israel relations, it's a revolution. It really is a revolution. And I think if we are objective about the situation, Israel is in the West. There's no question about that. We are very, very close with the United States. The United States is our most important partner. We have a relationship with NATO. Israel is not neutral. We are in the West. But of all the countries that have a close working relationship with the United States of America, I have no doubt that Israel has the most intense and the most intimate relationship with Russia. And we have seen this established at the very top. I remember President Putin's trip to Israel. I think it was 2004 or 5 when he met with Sharon. He has been back here many times since, most recently in January of this year when he came for the anniversary for the liberation of Auschwitz, 75th anniversary. And he was one of the many world leaders who came, but he was one of the more prominent, obviously. But we have built a relationship with Russia, which is very, very, very interesting. Once again, Israel is clearly in the West, but of all Western countries, as I say, we have the closest relationship with Russia. This has advantages, many strategic advantages, which I'm sure we will discuss, but there is also blowback. And if you are interested, I will share later with you, when I was in London, there was the incident in 2019 with Skripal in Britain, where Russian and British relations went very, very low into a crisis. And Britain expected all its allies to act in a certain way. And Israel chose not to act in the way that Britain requested. And I remember having to navigate a difficult time, but Israel made a choice. And for us, our special relationship with Russia in the framework of being a Western country is very important for our national security.
Thank you. I would like to say that generally Russian public opinion in general pro-Israel, and it's positively disposed toward Israel. It's interesting because maybe now, last 30 years, from my point of view, Russian-Israel relations maybe not very good, but from my point of view, not bad. Not bad. And it's very interesting. And Russian sympathy to Israel is very clear, and especially in Russian elite. It's interesting too. But I would like to ask Professor Barabanov, what do you think about it? What could we achieve?
Yes, I agree with the previous speaker that we have a kind of revolution in contemporary post-Soviet relations between Israel and Russia. That's true, the relations became much better. But just to say one word, the diplomatic relations were restored not by the independent Russian Federation, but still by the USSR in October 91. And Ambassador Bovin was the first and the last ambassador of the USSR to Israel, and then the first ambassador of the new Russia. So the situation was changing at the last years of the Soviet Union as well. And for now, I think that because I understand that our panel is in the framework of the global relations to our bilateral contacts. But I think what I'll speak about, it's also of global importance, at least for Russia. First of all is the policy of historical memory, because now we see what I would say the global wars of history on the Second World War, on other aspects, on communism, and so on. And Russian relations with many Western countries are not bad only politically, but also bad historically. We still continue these history wars with Poland, with Baltic states, with the US as well, because who of the allies was the most important in the allies coalition in the Second World War, were it the Soviet Union or the United States? And in that sense, Israel is one of the closest allies, I would say, in that sense, of Russia, because the Israeli approach to the Second World War, understandably deeply connected with the Holocaust and all these German atrocities, and the recognition of the Soviet and the Red Army affairs is very deeply positively appreciated by the Russian leadership, by the Russian elites, because this question of the historical memories became for Russia one of the global, really one of the aspects of our global strategy to show our strengths and our goodwill in history. And in that sense, Russia-Israel history relations focused on the Second World War and I repeat, are deeply appreciated in Russia. The second point, we also understand, and I agree with the ambassador, that Israel is in the Western larger coalition, that the United States is the major partner of Israel in the security sphere. It's understandable. And also, nevertheless, I'd like to say that we both, Russia and Israel, we found the kind of a niche for our security dialogue, for our security relations. If we look onto Syria, for example, I would say personally, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel so, that we are conducting a kind of parallel wars in Syria. And so the main idea, the main focus in our approaches to Syria is not to create additional problems to each other. And Israel is making a campaign for achieving its goals in Syria, Russia as well, and the relations are not interfering mainly with each other. Previously, it was also funny when I was preparing to this panel now, I read some articles of Russian and Israeli journalists on Syria, and it was interesting that previously, after every Israeli strike on Syria, the Israeli ambassador in Moscow was summoned to the Russian Foreign Ministry, and he received the formal note of protest. But in the last couple of years, this practice ceased, and I've read the interview of the current Israeli ambassador in Moscow who confirmed this. So in that sense, the parallel wars in Syria, I think it's a good achievement for us being, frankly speaking, in the opposite geopolitical blocks. The same, to some extent, to a lesser extent, I understand it, but to some extent is for our relations towards Iran. That I think that both Russia and Israel agree to disagree on the Iranian question. We have quite opposite strategies towards Iran, but that doesn't affect our general relations. And the last point is there were many talks, many speculations that after the fall of the Benjamin Netanyahu government, the relations could become worse because everybody knows the good personal relations between Netanyahu and Putin and more than 10 years of continuous cooperation. But now we can say that the relations became stable. There were visits of the Prime Minister Bennett, there were visit and several talks of the new Israeli foreign minister with the Russian foreign minister. And the relations does not become worse as it used to be in the Netanyahu times. It means that we have already the objective base for our relations. And the change in government, the change of political coalitions will not influence sharply these decisions. If I may compare, I understand it's not, maybe not for 100% correct comparison, but you can compare this objective base for Russia-Israel relations to Russian relations, let's say, with Italy or Germany, because whatever government is in power in Italy or in Germany, in general, their bilateral relations with Russia are quite constructive. And it depends exactly on the objective base, both politically and economically. And I think that we now have the objective base for long-term constructive relations between Israel and Russia. And that is really a revolution comparing with 30 years ago. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor. I would like to say that unfortunately, Omicron is a new terrible obstacle on the way of our cooperation. Israel borders are closed now again. But Professor, you mentioned global relations, and I would like to ask Ambassador Jeffrey about role of Great Third. Great Third is United States, a very important force in this region, and visible and invisible point in Russian-Israel triangle, if you like. What do you think about contemporary situation and future and obstacles on the way of our cooperation in this region?
First of all, I'd like to thank Daniel and the INSS for inviting me today, and I'm glad to see you all. Just a few initial remarks. One is the United States recognizes that Russia is an important player in the Middle East and has been for a long time. Its military, particularly nuclear weapons capability, its long-term relationship with Syria, its role as a major hydrocarbons producer, and its relationship with OPEC, and several other elements, including its ties that we just heard described with Israel, as well as certain other countries in the region, Turkey, again, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, make it one of the more significant outside forces in the region. Now, the question that the United States has is, what is Russia's goals in the region? We feel that we are in a competitive situation with Russia, different than, and I would distinguish the competitive situation we feel we are in with Russia, in Russia's near abroad in Europe, and different from the very significant problems we have in our bilateral relations, independent of the others. That is, we have worked with Russia, Syria is a good example, over the last 3 administrations on various ways to, I won't say go as far as end that conflict, but I would say to clarify positions on the conflict, to achieve limited deconfliction and other tactical goals, and generally to build up communication and trust. I see Israel as having done that to a far more significant degree than we have, but that makes sense because Israel's military operations in Syria are very different from ours. They take place in close proximity to Russian forces. They're against a de facto ally of Russia's, at least in Syria, Iran, and there are obviously complications, and it's a very interesting relationship to see carry on. In terms of the overall strategic situation, Israel finds itself, and I'll let the Israelis talk in more detail about this, increasingly under pressure from one country, Iran. My prediction is that the breadth and depth of Russian-Israeli relations, however good the communications at the presidential level, and they're really good, they have been really good, the nature of that relationship will be overshadowed by the situation vis-a-vis Iran and Israel, because for Israel, it's an existential issue, and for Iran, it's an ideological cause. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. I would like to ask Professor Sholaf about further the above. What are the problems that hinder the improvement of relations between Russia and Israel, or maybe not improvement? I mean progress, planning of future, and so on and so on. What do you think about this?
First of all, thank you for making me a professor. I'm not there yet, but you know, there's still time. We're all young. Maybe I'll get there. But as a former member of Knesset and member of the Defense and Foreign Relations Committee, and also I was on several delegations that had talks, including in Moscow, with our peers in both houses, parliament houses in Russia. I was able to hear their point of view, and I think the question is not of conflicts, and I think this was well expressed by the previous speakers. The question is to me a question of breadth. That is, how broad do we want those relationships to be? Where can we take them beyond the immediate scope? And the immediate scope, as well expressed before me, is the tactical scope. There are good connections. You know, there's a red phone line, what we call a red phone, where and an IDF officer picks up the receiver, and there's a Russian officer on the other side of the line, and it helped, except for one notable case, it really helped deconfliction and helped us avoid what could have been a very stressful situation for both countries. But the question is, does it stop there? Because Russia is a global force, because Russia is a global entity. Russia has interests that go way beyond this region. And Israel, being a regional power, I won't say more than that, but the regional power, the question is, where and how do we take this to the next step? Now, I think on the Russian side, and of course you will be able to describe it better than I do, a lot of it had to do with seeing Israel, right or wrong, as a sort of gate to Washington. And this came to the fore in something that became public, and this was an exchange between the Russian NSC head, Mr. Patrushev, and the head of the Israeli NSC, Meir Ben Shabbat, who's with us now with the INSS, and the Russian way, and I won't get into the details of it, but what the Russian Mr. Patrushev conveyed was, we'll be able to expand the field, including, of course, Iran, which is, as all of you have mentioned rightly, which is so far, and this could change in the future, but so far has mutual interests with Russia in Syria. If you want us to expand it, then maybe what we need is an expansion on the American side. But that never went beyond that. And to me, the question is, are Israel and Russia ready to expand those relationships even further? Because if we keep it to the tactical regional level, to the question of how do we avoid conflict in Syria, well, we've shown over the past 6 years that we can do that and quite effectively. And of course, and you talked about personal relationships. I think both Russia and Israel are way beyond that. You know, we see things according to our interests, and also you got to remember when you talk about the ties between Russia and Israel, that there are over 1 million people living in Israel who came from the former USSR, most of them from Russia, and they form an integral and very important part of the fabric of Israeli life. So our level of understanding, our level of communication with Russia has changed dramatically since the times of the USSR and the real division that stood between us. So are we ready to go to the next step? Hopefully we are, because I think that could serve the interests of both countries. I think it could help Russia, stabilize what it wants to achieve in this region, and also build a more comprehensive relationship, both with Israel and with Israel's allies in the West. And it would definitely help Israel, because Russia, once again, touches upon many things, many interests that we have in the world. Are there discussions going on about it as we speak? As far as I know, not, and it hasn't happened, or it hadn't happened during the days of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Notwithstanding his good personal relationship with President Putin. I think we should go there, both sides, and I think it would serve not only us, but stability in the Middle East and in other regions as well.
Thank you very much indeed. I just mentioned that if somebody looks like professor, speaks like professor, it means
I'll take it. Thank you.
At the same time, you were a member of Knesset. It's double professor or triple. It's possible. Tom, you don't need questions. You know everything. I'm absolutely sure. But anyway, but seriously, it's a very interesting situation. A lot of risks, a lot of opportunities. And I think that, of course, there are a lot of countries in the world, but it seems to me Russian-Israel relations is an important element of contemporary world. And in some sense, crucial point. And I know you have written an article about triangle. What do you think about possible future?
Thank you, Andrea. I think that's a very good question. At the beginning of this discussion, you cast some doubt on the ability for Israel to act as a bridge between the United States and Russia. And I'd like to address that issue in a few minutes. And I'd be interested to hear what my colleagues on the panel have to say in reaction. I think we'll remember back in June of 2019, Israel actually hosted a trilateral meeting at the National Security Council advisor level for one day in Jerusalem. This dialogue came at a time of increased tensions between the United States and Iran, and not surprisingly, Iran was a focus of much of the discussion. Now it's clear that there was no meeting of the minds during these discussions, but what was at least reported publicly, all the sides, including the United States National Security Advisor, the Russian Security Council Secretary, thought that the discussion had been useful, at least in clarifying positions and providing a better understanding of what the possibilities were going forward for US-Russian interaction in the region. And of course, for Israel, this was a major coup, I would argue. It allowed Israel to play a role, not only in the regional level, but I think more broadly in bringing the United States and Russia together for discussions. And it enhanced Israel's diplomatic standing throughout the region, and indeed more broadly than that. Now, I think this was a good undertaking, but there was no follow through to it, in part because the American National Security Advisor was ousted a few months after that meeting. We got into a series of electoral politics in Israel that precluded a follow-on meeting. Now, the question is whether it makes sense to move in that direction at the current moment. It's clear that the relationship between the United States and Russia is adversarial. The relationship is one where we're divided by our worldviews, geopolitical interests, and values. And the most that you could hope for, I would argue, in the relationship between the United States and Russia at this time is some effort to manage the competition responsibly and then find some few areas where we can cooperate, preventing the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, for example, maybe dealing with climate change and so forth. This is akin to the detente that we pursued in the 1970s, but there's a significant difference between that period and now. And that is that the world of 1970s was bipolar. That's clearly not the way the world operates today. We're moving towards a multipolar, polycentric world. And it's also clear that the US-Russian relationship doesn't define the international system today as it did 30 or 40 years ago. The main axis of international development is actually US-China at this point. But I think what this means is that, that the US-Russian relationship can no longer be thought of as simply a bipolar context. And that means that the diplomacy between our two countries cannot simply be bipolar or bilateral. The bilateral relationship needs to be embedded in a broader multilateral relationship. And you've seen the United States and Russia over the past several years engage in what I would call ad hoc coalitions of the necessary on specific problems. Probably the prime example of that for the region that we're discussing now is the P5+1 to deal with the Iran nuclear issue. But I think that in the current circumstances, that it makes sense to expand these multilateral coalitions, to make them routine, to have them discuss strategic issues and regional security architecture. Now, I think it's clear that you can't do this at the official level. I see no real interest in Washington or Moscow for a trilateral discussion with the Israelis about the broader Middle East, but certainly at the expert level, we ought to be able to do this. And in many ways, Israel makes an ideal partner for these discussions and a way of moderating perhaps the competition between the United States and Russia. We know that Israel is a leading power in the Middle East, probably the best military, the most complex and diversified economy. It's beginning to develop relations with the more moderate Arab states. And so it's in a position, I think, to to reach out to both Russia and the United States, in part because of the good relations. Now, as we've already discussed, the relationship between the United States and Israel really is values-based. Israel is part of the West. The relationship with Russia is more interest-based, but nevertheless has flourished over the past several years. And I think this provides a basis for a trilateral conversation. Now, very, very quickly, what would the agenda be? What would these two countries talk about? I think at the top of the list should be sort of the regional security architecture, or what the vision is for the new strategic equilibrium in the Middle East. Now, it's clear that Russia enjoys a good tactical working relationship with the Iranians at this point. But from my discussions in Moscow with various people, I think it's quite clear that Russia has no interest in Iran dominating the Middle East. They want a multipolar environment in the Middle East. And so I think there's room for discussion with Washington, with Jerusalem, about how we would manage an equilibrium over the longer term. What would it look like? And how should the United States and Russia in particular act as outside powers to foster the development of a sustainable equilibrium? Second issue, obvious one, is Iran nuclear. I think none of our countries has an interest in Iran developing a nuclear weapon. We look at the situation, obviously, in radically different ways. But I think there is room for at least a discussion about how we constrain Iran's nuclear ambitions. And then finally, terrorism. Again, we all have an interest in dealing with this issue in an effective way. We have different definitions of terrorism. We don't identify the same groups as terrorists in the Middle East. But a discussion that would help us better understand the perspectives of the other side, of what the room would be for, if not joint action, at least parallel actions to deal with international terrorism would be a good start. And finally, we could talk about the Eastern Mediterranean, an area of increasing preoccupation for all three of our countries, where we need to sort out our views and what the possibilities are going forward. So finally, let me say, as I started, I don't think this is a conversation to be had at the official level, but certainly this is something that I think we pursued quite constructively among experts from our three countries. So let me leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed. Follow up your words. I can say that bridge building is a serious challenge, and each bridge has a lot of support elements. And Tom, you speak about practical steps. And I have a question to our Israel colleagues, later to Mr. Barabanov. Can the state of affairs in the Middle East and this region be corrected by joint efforts of Russia and Israel, or more likely a broader alliance is needed? And how this process could be managed? What should we do? Who is first? Maybe Mark is first. Will be first.
So I'm not sure I have a total answer to your question, but I will give a partial answer. What was said, I agree with, that the Israel-Russian relations are good. And in many ways, the test case for that is Syria. Yes, when my colleague talks about the phone and that we've successfully built deconfliction, where we found a way that Russian and Israeli interests don't have to clash directly. This is a major success. It was not preordained. It took serious work by both the Russian and the Israeli leaderships to reach a situation where Israel can defend itself and look after its strategic interests in Syria. And at the same time, Russia has its interests protected. My question is this, and I follow on the point made by Ofer. Is it possible to upgrade this? So we have deconfliction, that's good. Is it possible to build something now that the situation in Syria is moving on, that we are moving into a post-civil war situation? Is it possible to find a situation which both takes into account Israel's national security needs and respects Russia's unique position in Syria, that we can build a future which is good for Russia, good for Israel, and of course, good for Syria. Now, we would see such a future, including the absence of Iran. From my perspective, we can have the Iranians have a huge, big victory celebration in Damascus, and they should go home. But if Syria is to have a better future, a more peaceful future with development, well, before development, reconstruction, yes, and trying to get the country back in there, is it possible that Russia can play a role here with Israel once again to upgrade the communication between us, to try to build a better situation in Syria, one that respects both Russia's interests and Israel's interests, and is ultimately good for Syria too? I think the question is open on this issue, but I would think we would be irresponsible if we didn't try seriously to do something along these lines. I actually think, and I could be wrong, but I actually think on the Iranian issue, it was said before me by someone smarter than me that we are agreeing to disagree. Actually, on this issue in Syria, is it possible that we can find a convergence of interest that would be very, very significant for both our countries and possibly bring benefits to both our countries? I leave it as a question.
Let me just add a couple of points, both to what was presented as the agenda for these possible discussions, and maybe that'll help us tie together, because of course we're going to solve every problem in our discussion here. One is the situation in Lebanon. Okay, Lebanon is decomposing before our eyes, and that could set not only the Middle East. I mean, they could set the whole Middle East, but definitely the Syria, Israel, Lebanon triangle, with the Russians, of course, being there and having great interests there. That could set the whole thing on fire inadvertently, and this has happened more than once. So, and the other point, of course, is economics, which always can serve as a means to create mutual benefit. And I say, if President Putin, when he discusses or has discussed so far the future of Syria, for example, in Astana, and he did this with President Erdogan of Turkey and President Rouhani, the former president of Iran, but not with the Israelis, and I'm not even saying the Israelis necessarily in the room, but the Israeli interest on the table. Once we include things like Lebanon and economics in there, so we already have 5 points to discuss, and Israel should be there because Israel, as far as Lebanon and economics, for example, not to say Iran, of course, is a major player. All of a sudden, we have this wide field that we can discuss and create mutually beneficial agreements or points of discussion, so that really we could help, first of all, stabilize the region and be mutually beneficial to each other.
Thank you very much, Professor Barabanov.
Yes, I agree, and me personally, I support the idea of continuing the trilateral dialogue between the US, Israel, and Russia on the regional issues and on the broader issues. But in fact, just now we are starting or continuing the expert trilateral dialogue. If the panel will be posted on the web openly, I think it would be quite useful to continue it. But in what Russia could be interested to promote this trilateral kind of dialogue and made it not only expert, but I think political as well, is there are some official Russian proposals on confidence-building measures on the Gulf and larger in the Middle East. Sure, it looks like Helsinki 2, it looks like OSCE 2 with regional specifics, and there were not too much positive reaction on these proposals when they were promoted. But at least basing on this, not only on this, it's a rational proposal. The US might have its own ones. The Israeli politicians might have their own ones. But what we already achieved in Syria, it's a very good confidence building measures. This red phone, as the colleague said, between the Russian and Israeli military. And we all agree that this at least of this red phone would be useful. I don't think that it will be posted tomorrow between Jerusalem and Tehran, but if there will be one, I think it will be a good confidence building measure. And if our trilateral dialogue could contribute to this, it would be good. And there is the last point, a funny one. I repeat, when I was reading some latest Russian newspaper articles on Israel this morning, it was an interesting thing that almost every time when Russia and Israel have something serious bilaterally, or the summit, or the important bilateral meeting, at the same day or immediately after, there was an example when there was the Israeli foreign minister in Moscow a year or a couple of years ago. At the same day, there were the Hezbollah representatives in Moscow. At another point, at the same day, there was the telephone call of the Iranian foreign minister to Moscow. But I just have to quote the Israeli ambassador in Moscow, Ambassador Ben Zvi, who said that it's a mere coincidence. So we cannot think on the double game here. But seriously speaking, we understand that Russia have another dialogue with the Muslim countries of the region, with Iran as well, with Turkey as well. And maybe it will be just a plus, just a strength on the Russian side in if we continue our trilateral dialogue, that Russia will be able to speak simultaneously with Iran, with Syria, with Turkey, with some of Arabian countries. And in that sense, I agree that for the Astana triangle, Turkey, Russia, Iran, it would be quite difficult to find a fourth place for Israel because the Iranians would not agree absolutely. But taking two simultaneous dialogues together would be quite useful, and I think we can also start on this. And maybe the very last point, Tom Graham mentioned the climate change, and now after the Glasgow conference, we have many. We all need the strategies on green investments, I would say, yeah. To restructure our energy sectors, to build the hydrogen energy sector, and so on. And in that sense, I'm sure that Russia and Israel will strengthen our bilateral economic talks on green investments. But I think why not? We could discuss it in trilateral level with the United States as well, because at least there are some things that will be useful for all three countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Ambassador Jeffrey, for instance, what do you think about future United States behavior, political position? Is the United States ready to join for such kind of dialogue? If yes, on what terms?
Good question. First of all, Jim Jeffrey, not necessarily the US government, as a former career diplomat, always believes on open channels, always believes in maximum putting cards on the table and building trust, personal relationships, avoiding misunderstandings. The difference between me and many people who advocate that is I don't think that overcomes basic geostrategic problems. I think it makes basic geostrategic problems much more able to be dealt with in a rational manner without surprises, collapses, crises, and other things that could be avoided. But you still have the underlying basic geostrategic problems. They're not resolved by simply hotlines. We have our own hotline with the Russians in Syria, and that doesn't mean we have advanced on that front. Now, having good relations and shared views on certain issues, be it climate, be it Iranian nuclear weapons, does not only serve those tactical purposes, but develop a larger sense of trust, and that becomes a sunk cost that people want to preserve. Thus, for example, between Israel and Russia, there is certainly far less interference on the part of Russia in the internal affairs of Israel than we perceive in the United States. And from the Russian side, I'm sure that they do not fear think that Israel has tried to intervene, interfere, or change the domestic situation in Russia, unlike the attitude towards the United States, fair or not. In terms of cooperation, be it on Syria or on these wider questions of a geostrategic change in the region, a couple of points. One, I'm very much in favor of talking with Russia and involving Israel as well as other countries, but you have to do this, as we just heard by Oleg, in various different baskets because of countries don't get along with each other. It's not just Iran and Israel, it's the bad relations still between Israel and Turkey, even though objectively they're both major players in Syria with some overlapping interests. So you can do this, and I still think that this administration, the Biden administration, will eventually get around to talking seriously with Russia again on Syria, and I think that there is a possible way forward. We came close when Pompeo met with President Putin in Sochi in May of 2019. More generally, though, and this gets to the point of a geostrategic shift in the region, a Gulf OSCE. I've seen the ideas from the Russian Foreign Ministry and Vitaly Namkin and others. Here's the problem, to be honest. There is a security order in the United States. However shaky it's been under the last few presidents and whatever problems it is based upon a collective security system led by the United States. We have 50,000 troops. We spend $10 billion a year in security assistance. We have troops and bases in 11 countries, counting Turkey and in Israel in the country, not our own bases, but places where we are. And that is a security system. And we are very concerned about maintaining that security system, as are our partners and allies. That forms the framework within which we, the United States, and our partners and allies will respond to things like a regional OSCE for the region. To some degree, we will respond to that a bit like Russia has responded to US ideas and European ideas for integration of Caucasus and near abroad countries such as Ukraine and Belarus into the larger European family with suspicion and some concern. That's simply the way it is. I don't think that's going to change. The key problem, frankly, is Iran. If Russia wants a multilateral OSCE kind of deal, and I worked on the OSCE, I know the details pretty well, for the region, objectively, you have to some degree, enable a bigger role for Iran in the region. But to quote Henry Kissinger, Iran, I'm misquoting Henry Kissinger, even Graham might change. Iran is more a cause in the region than it is a state. And until it acts like a state, any effort to enhance its role in order to create a balance of competing nations, Russia, US, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Turkey, Iran, is going to run afoul of our concerns. Now, I say this as a private speaker. Frankly, the Biden administration hasn't figured all of this out yet, but the trajectory of where it is going, thud in the night, quietly, I think will get them to where other administrations have been. And I think eventually this will limit Israel's ability to work with Russia because at some point, Israel will have to decide whether it likes the current security system in the region, or it is going to weigh in for something different and something that is going to reduce the role of the United States. Again, we'll have to see. It may be that this administration will conclude that it doesn't want a big role in the United States, but it just finished its defense review with no decision on reducing forces in the Middle East. So I wouldn't hold our breath for a change in American policy. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Tom, are you satisfied discussion about your ideas? And question. Let's imagine United States is very busy. Can Russia, Israel, and other regional countries can operate without the United States to reach agreement, to live on their own? Is it possible or not today in reality?
Well, it's a very good question, Andrei, but I would build on what Jim Jeffries has just said. I mean, the United States is engaged in the region. We do have a collective security arrangement that has worked quite well over the years. I think it's quite clear that at the strategic level, the United States would like to focus more of its resources on East Asia, specifically dealing with the challenge, that strategic challenge we perceive coming from China, that is going to last for years, if not decades, across a very broad front. But the United States, while it's reassessing its global position, is not going to abandon the Middle East. It's still an important element in our foreign policy thinking. It has implications for the way we deal with proliferation issues, terrorism, obviously energy at this point. But I think it's also clear that Russia has returned to the Middle East in a significant way, and a much more active geopolitical player than it had been for, say, the period of the 1980s, 1990s, and indeed into the 2000s, and something that the United States has to recognize. Israel is probably our key partner in the region. I think we appreciate the fact that it does enjoy a good working relationship with the Russians. I appreciate the views of our Israeli colleagues, particularly about the need to upgrade the relationship with Russia to advance their own interests, but also to ensure that Russia's legitimate concerns are taken into account. The only point I would stress here is that as Israel moves in that direction, it's going to need to remain in very close contact with the United States, because as Jim Jeffries said, I mean, you could cross a line where you have to choose between an American-led collective security arrangement in the Middle East, or move to something that is perhaps more along the lines of what the Russians are proposing at this point. That situation, I believe, makes it even more important that we continue a trilateral dialogue to begin to understand what is at stake, what the various views of the various countries are, and in particular, how we're going to manage the role of Iran in the Middle East. One of the ways we got to an OSCE arrangement in Europe in the 1970s was a very explicit or deliberate decision on the part of the United States to treat the Soviet Union then not as a cause, but as a geopolitical great power that provided a basis for serious negotiation. I don't know if we're there, we're certainly not there with Iran right now. Whether we can get there over the next several years is, I think, a fundamental question of how we're going to continue to organize the Middle East over the long term, and whether we can find an equilibrium that satisfies the interest of the major powers in the region, starting with Israel, but also including the two major outside powers, Russia and the United States.
Thank you very much indeed, colleagues. We are close to the final of our discussion, but it seems to me we have 2-3 minutes, maybe 4 minutes, maybe some last comments. Colleagues, short, very brief comments. If not, I would like to say thank you very much indeed. It seems to me this discussion, it's very nice discussion, but and finally, I can say that what we need is divine providence in this region, because without external forces and situation is not very optimistic, unfortunately. But I hope our discussion will be useful for our common mutual understanding of situation and each other. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
שלום, אני שמח מאוד לחתום כנס חשוב זה לציון 30 שנה לכינון היחסים בין ישראל לבין רוסיה. עברנו כברת דרך, עליות ומורדות, אבל היחסים הם איתנים, מסועפים, עמדו במבחנים לא פשוטים ומהווים נדבך חשוב במערך יחסי החוץ של ישראל, ודומני כי הם גם גורם לא זניח במערך יחסי החוץ של רוסיה. אנחנו בעידן גיאופוליטי שאחד המאפיינים העיקריים שלו הוא היותו מולטיפולרי, כלומר עולם בו יש מספר מעצמות חשובות, כאשר רוסיה היא ללא ספק אחת מהמרכזיות שבהם. יתרה מזאת, המערכת איננה יציבה, אלא פלואידית מאוד, וזה בולט במיוחד במזרח התיכון. אכן רוסיה קנתה לה אחיזה משמעותית במרחב הקרוב אלינו, בפרט בסוריה, והפכה לגורם מפתח. ומכאן שהפכנו לשכנים, ולשמחתנו נבנו יחסי עבודה טובים בהקשר הזה, מבוססים על הבנות בשל האינטרסים של כל אחד, חלקם חופפים, חלקם פחות, אבל תוך כיבוד הדדי, זהירות ואורך רוח. אבל הקשר של ישראל עם רוסיה הולך הרבה מעבר למישור של יחסי חוץ וביטחון לאומי. בישראל חיים כיום יותר ממיליון יוצאי ברית המועצות לשעבר, אשר שומרים ומטפחים את המורשת הרוסית, אשר יש לה נוכחות מאוד בולטת בישראל, בתרבות, במדע, בכלכלה, ברפואה. וזה מהווה כשלעצמו גשר אנושי משמעותי בין העמים ובין המדינות. אין עוד קבוצה בישראל הדומה לה, לא בהיקף, לא בביטוי המוחשי שלה בחברה הישראלית, ולא כגשר למדינה אחרת. יש כאן משהו מאוד ייחודי. וזה מביא בין היתר לפיתוח יחסים כלכליים בין המדינות, שהם מעבר ליחסים בין ממשלות כמובן, ולקשרי תיירות, תרבות ועוד. זה אם כן הרקע הכל כך ייחודי, שכנות גיאופוליטית בעלת חשיבות אסטרטגית ממדרגה ראשונה לישראל, וקשר אנושי תרבותי רחב מאוד. בעשור האחרון, המכון למחקרי ביטחון לאומי נמצא בשיח מתמשך עם מוסדות מקבילים לו ברוסיה, אשר נועד להגביר את ההבנה בין הצדדים, תוך הכרה בשונות האינטרסים, אך בה בעת בצורך להקשיב זה לזה, לחדד את הסוגיות שבמחלוקת, תוך ניסיון אמיתי לזהות מרחבי מפגש אינטרסים. המכון מייחס חשיבות גדולה מאוד להמשך הדיאלוג הזה, בין היתר בגלל רצונה של ישראל למצב את עצמה כגשר מדיני, כלכלי ותרבותי בין המעצמות, ובינן לבין מדינות האזור. הדיאלוגים האלה עם הגופים המקבילים ברוסיה הובילו לקובץ מאמרים על יחסי ישראל-רוסיה, בשלוש שפות דרך אגב, שיוצא כעת לאור לרגל ציון 30 שנה לכינון היחסים, ואני רוצה בהזדמנות זאת לברך על כך. אני סבור שזה ספר מקורי חשוב, אשר תהיה לו תהודה רבה, שכן הוא ממלא צורך אקוטי שלא היה לו מענה עד כה. כמו כן, השיח בין ה-NSS לבין מקביליו ברוסיה הוביל לכנס הזה,
שגם הוא מהווה ביטוי הן לחשיבות של הקשרים בין המדינות והן לצורך בדיאלוג אינטנסיבי, רציני, ענייני בין הצדדים. אם נחזור לרגע לקובץ המאמרים, הוא מציג מבט היסטורי רב-תחומי על היחסים בין שתי המדינות, בו נידונים הקשרים בין הקהילה היהודית ברוסיה לבין אזרחי ישראל שעלו מברית המועצות לשעבר, המורשת המשותפת ביחס לקהילות היהודיות במזרח אירופה, הקשרים הכלכליים שלאורך שנים התאפיינו בדינמיקה מעניינת של תחרות ושיתוף פעולה, הקשרים המדיניים הדו-צדדיים במספר זירות במזרח התיכון, וההתנהלות בעידן חזרתה של התחרות בין המעצמות למוקד היחסים הבינלאומיים. הקובץ הוא פרויקט משותף בין ה-INSS לבין אוניברסיטת MGMO במוסקבה, המובילה בתחומה ברוסיה, שנכתב על ידי חוקרים מישראל, מרוסיה ומארצות הברית. כל אחד דרך כתב בשפתו, זה יוצא דופן, ואנו מפרסמים את הקובץ במספר שפות במטרה לחשוף את הקוראים ואת קהילת המומחים לזוויות התבוננות שונות על אותן סוגיות. אני רוצה לבסוף להודות לכל מי שעשה במלאכה, לכל מי שהביא לארגונו המוצלח של כנס זה. ראשית כל כמובן למשתתפי הפאנלים מישראל, מרוסיה וממקומות נוספים, לאוניברסיטת MGMO, שיחד איתה אנו מפרסמים את הקובץ, למכון המזרחנות של האקדמיה הרוסית למדעים, על שנים ארוכות של שותפות עם ה-INSS, ל-LS גרופ על סיוע בארגון הכנס והפקת קובץ המאמרים, לקונגרס היהודי היורו-אסייתי ולעמותת מעלות על תמיכה בכנס, לשגרירות רוסיה בישראל, למטה משרד החוץ בירושלים ולשגרירתנו במוסקבה, ולכל צוות ההפקה, הדיגיטל והיח"צ של ה-INSS, ואנשי תוכנית רוסיה במכון, ובראשם לדניאל רקוב, עמית מחקר בתוכנית רוסיה ב-INSS, אשר עמל קשות כדי שכל זה יקרה. ולבסוף, אני רוצה להודות לצבי מגן, האדם שיותר מכל אחד אחר במדינת ישראל, אחראי לפיתוח היחסים בין המדינות, בשלל תפקידים שהוא עשה במהלך קריירה מפוארת. לא רק זאת, אלא שהוא מביא איתו הבנה עמוקה, רחבה, שקולה, של מערכת היחסים והאינטרסים, ואנחנו אסירי תודה לפועלו, אני מתכוון למדינת ישראל וכמובן ל-INSS, אנחנו אסירי תודה לפועלו, לייזום הקובץ והכנס, ותרשו לי גם להודות לו אישית על תרומתו האדירה ל-INSS, לא רק בעניין רוסיה, אלא בכלל. תודה רבה לכם.